to Esther, though. This is a wonderful book. The Jewish holiday of Purim is based on the book of Esther. It's a unique book in the Old Testament in that it does not mention God by name or by title even once. And yet, he is not absent in this book. If you think God isn't in the book of Esther, you need to read a little bit closer. He is all over the happenings in this book. The entire story is about how he works through his servants to bring about his purposes. Hello, and welcome back to FAIR's Come Follow Me podcast for Old Testament year. I'm Jennifer Roach Lees. Today we are talking about Esther. Also, this is the week of the FAIR conference. It's happening this week in Lehi, Utah. I will be there. I will be there most of the time. I have to run down to BYU and teach class during the middle of it. However, I will be there most of the time, and I'd love to meet you. If you come, please find me and say hello. Back to Esther, though. This is a wonderful book. The Jewish holiday of Purim is based on the book of Esther. It's a unique book in the Old Testament in that it does not mention God by name or by title even once. And yet, he is not absent in this book. If you think God isn't in the book of Esther, you need to read a little bit closer. He is all over the happenings in this book. The entire story is about how he works through his servants to bring about his purposes. Esther is also unique in that it's one of only 2 books in the Old Testament named after a woman. And unlike many stories of women in the Old Testament who have no power, Esther is an example of someone who is acting and not being acted upon. Right? She takes the power that she has and makes something out of it for the good of other people, not for her own good, but for the good of her entire community. So, in my reading for this episode, I came across such a wide variety of ways that Esther has been portrayed throughout the years. Martin Luther did not like the book of Esther at all. He didn't even want it to be in the canon. Oddly, some modern interpreters that have cast Esther as like very vain, very sexualized. Others are really patronizing towards her by continually pointing out how brave she was for a woman, and that she had a great ability to stand up to her faith compared to others of her gender. It's a little patronizing, perhaps not the fairest treatment that we could give to Esther. But in all my reading, what I was most taken by actually comes from an interview with Jean Bingham. She's the past Relief Society General President. And she contextualizes Esther as being this very powerful example, specifically for young women, or for young women of all ages. She sees Esther as being a powerful example for women to follow in terms of how they use their authority and their spiritual strength. The interview, you could find it on the Religious Studies website. It's hosted on the BYU site. The interview is called Empowering Young Women Through Female Role Models in the Old Testament. It's fantastic. Now, when we talk about women and authority in the church, it often centers around, should women in our church have the priesthood? And I think that's just such a boring question, to be honest. If you look at the scriptures, you see women using their gifts and authority all over the place. They don't wait for someone to decide to give them permission to do so. They just do. In terms of this passage, to argue that Esther should or should not have had the priesthood just doesn't make any sense. She doesn't need the priesthood to save the day, but she definitely does save the day. What she needs is courage, a very specific kind of courage in this scenario. It's one thing to be placed in a role or a calling where the expectations are pretty clearly laid out and you're relatively sure that people in your ward or your stake are going to follow your lead because they understand the structure and they understand callings, and you don't run a huge risk of having to kind of put your neck out. It's another thing entirely to lead in what Bingham calls an unsolicited calling, mostly because it has no guarantee of success. Not that every calling in the church has guarantee of success, but it's definitely more well-defined, and people know what to do with you. Esther is a perfect example of this unsolicited calling. She has no guarantee of success. Just Just as an aside, I'm actually working on a paper right now for an upcoming conference with FAIR in the fall about the New Testament. I believe FAIR will publish this in a book as well. It'll be a chapter. It's about women's use of priesthood power in the New Testament. I'm super excited about it. Stay tuned to this channel for more. So before we get into Sister Bingham's analysis on Esther, let's walk through the story of Esther just so you know what's going on. So it starts with King Xerxes. He's a Persian king. He's very powerful. He defeats Babylon and Egypt. He invades Greece because he wants to punish Athens for its support of one of his enemies. He takes on many construction projects. He's a big deal. He's a very, very powerful king. We're in about 450 BC right here. And Xerxes is pretty used to getting his own way. In the beginning of the story, he asks his queen, not Esther, a different woman, her name is Vashti. He asks her to essentially appear before his officials to display her beauty, and she refuses to do this. And so he banishes her out of his court. She's no longer queen, and he decides he needs to look for a new queen. And he does this by holding kind of a royal beauty pageant to find a replacement. And Esther, she's a young Jewish girl. She's orphaned. She's being raised by her cousin, Mordecai. She is conscripted into this beauty contest. She does not volunteer herself. She is told, you will be participating in this contest. She doesn't put herself forward. The king's eunuch actually finds her and takes her to the pageant. She has no choice. But she ends up being chosen as the new queen. However, in order to do this, she has to keep her Jewish heritage a secret. And her cousin, Mordecai, has warned her about this, that it would be dangerous for her to reveal her Jewish heritage. So no one knows, certainly not the king, that she's a Jew. The plot thickens when the king's high-ranking official, Haman, demands total obedience. Mordecai refuses to bow to him. Haman essentially wants people to bow down to him. And Mordecai, the cousin of Esther, says, no way, I'm not doing that. It infuriates Haman. He retaliates by plotting the annihilation of all Jews in the empire. So he's able to talk the king, King Xerxes, into this, that all the Jews should be executed. Now remember, the king does not know that Esther is a Jew. So Esther has found favor with the king, and her cousin Mordecai urges her to use her position to save her people. He famously suggests that she has obtained royalty for such a time as this, meaning you have been put in this place, and now here's this crisis, and you're in exactly the right spot to at least give it a try. So what Esther does is she decides she's going to approach the king without an invitation. This is a crime punishable by death. You were not allowed to do that. So she invites the king and Haman to 2 banquets where she cleverly exposes Haman's plot, and then she reveals her own identity as being one of the Jews. And the king is outraged. Haman is executed in the very gallows, by the way, he built for Mordecai. While the original royal decree, in their legal system, it actually couldn't be revoked. The king issues a new edict that says if the Jews are attacked, they're allowed to defend themselves. They triumph over their enemies. A victory is celebrated to this day. It is the joyful Jewish holiday of Purim. So that's the story. Back to President Bingham. She teaches that figures such as Esther are not merely these historical relics, but are essential modern blueprints for leadership, especially for women. For contemporary women, navigating a world of filth and darkness, as Esther did, requires more than just a passive belief or a passive waiting to be asked to do something. It demands powerful leadership, even when that leadership comes in the form of an unsolicited calling. Esther did not audition for her role as queen. She was brought into the king's house and thrust into this position that she did not choose. She was forced into the beauty pageant. Remember, she didn't volunteer for it. And her journey demonstrates that leadership often begins not with the luxury of choice. Sometimes you find yourself needing to lead on a topic or in a scenario because here you are and maybe you didn't even want to be there, but this is what it is. She also finds that she needs courage to respond to a divine mandate that probably disrupted her own personal plans. This is not what Esther had planned for her life, but it is what happened to her. She didn't sit around and have a pity party over it. She decided, all right, what can I do? How can I be on the Lord's side? So Bingham goes on and establishes a direct correlation between a leader's internal purity and their external capacity for influence. In the Persian court, which was a competitive environment defined by some pretty superficial standards, beauty standards, Esther's differentiator was not her physical beauty. It was her internal virtue. Esther's internal purity basically provides her with a level of confidence that was unmatched by her peers. Now, if the king's eunuchs are going around the country gathering all of the most beautiful women to put into a contest, you can assume that every woman in that beauty contest was among the most beautiful women in her country. It is not Esther's beauty that makes her stand head and shoulders above her peers. It's her internal level of confidence. This is what's going on with Esther. This kind of power coming from her purity is what brings her political and spiritual influence. Now, just as an aside, sometimes in our culture, we have criticisms for what it gets called purity culture, which is this perhaps very strict or very harshly enforced idea about what young women or women in general can wear or say or do. And some of that critique is right. Women and men, frankly, have been harmed by this purity culture. However, just because harm has been done in purity culture, the culture of that should be thrown away, but not the purity. The purity must remain, and we see it here in Esther and what she does with it, what she allows that purity to kind of empower her to do is fantastic. She's not a victim of some purity culture. She is living in purity. The move away from purity culture is not, well, let's forget all standards. It's, no, go back to what actual true purity is. This waxing strong of confidence, it's not an abstract psychological state. Bingham explicitly links this strength to the power of the endowment and of temple garments. She argues that just as the garment serves as a constant reminder of our covenantal power, Esther's internal virtue provided the confidence required to navigate this very high-stakes game that she has found herself in. The internal structure of her virtue provided the necessary foundation for Esther to move from her private righteousness to public leadership. In other words, Esther was not sitting around worried that she couldn't act because she didn't have the priesthood. She had the purity that gave her the confidence that she needed to step into the leadership role that was obvious in front of her. Esther needed that confidence because the task in front of her wasn't to, organize an office or do some domestic task. It was for her to put her life at risk in front of a very powerful king, ask a hard question. One of the most famous lines in the book, Esther says, "If I perish, I perish," indicating she knows what's at stake here. She absolutely knows how this could go wrong, and she willingly takes on the task. She's not anybody's puppet. She's not anybody's servant in this moment. She weighs up the risk. She weighs up what the benefit could be, and she decides to act because of the potential life-saving consequences that it could have for her people. She is discerning what is needed and deliberately chooses the path of danger. Bingham talks about how the sacrifice is not merely a suggestion on the covenant path. The covenant path requires sacrifice. It's a leadership directive. You will sacrifice. You will sacrifice to maintain your purity. You will sacrifice to lead. Esther's willingness to lose her life as the ultimate example of placing eternal purposes above personal safety is an example for us all to stand in awe of. In the "if I perish, I perish" framework, sacrifice is a choice to give up the world to gain the power of God. And Esther shows detachment honestly, from self-preservation in favor of saving her kinsmen. In some ways, Esther is not doing this alone. She's not with her family. She's not even with her people. She's living in the palace. But she is also very much connected to the communal power of her people. Before she goes to the king, she makes this request, and she tells her cousin to gather the Jews and have them fast and pray for 3 days. She's not going in there trying to be this spiritual superhero all on her own. She's leveraging the spiritual investment of her entire community. The sacrifice was hers, but her people's support strengthened her and enabled her to move forward without flinching. Her courage is most visible when Esther reveals her heritage as a Jew. Her people were marked for destruction. She's essentially raising her hand and saying, I am one of them that you are going to kill. Revealing her true identity was an act of extreme vulnerability that she otherwise wouldn't have had to take. She could have stayed in the shadows. But she needed to advocate for her people, to be a Christ figure for them, so that they were not annihilated. The faithfulness of a single individual can unify a fractured body of believers. Bingham identifies the so what of the Esther narrative in this multiplier effect of collective sacrifice. When a leader acts in faith, it creates a ripple effect that strengthens the identity of the group. It does not matter if that leader is in a formal given calling or if they are in a calling, as Bingham describes, that Esther was in, one that found her. Jews were not passive spectators in this. They were unified participants in Esther's risk. That unity transforms them from potential victims into this spiritual fighting force in a sense. Esther's story gives us a reminder that a woman's name is known to the Lord. Regardless of her worldly status, regardless of her holding a priesthood office, her impact was measured by her righteousness, her purity, and her covenantal alignment, not her popularity in the Persian court or her title in Jewish society. Bingham says these ancient principles of unity and identity serve as a foundation for modern action. Her analysis concludes with kind of an aggressive directive for modern women. Do not wait. She warns against the waiting trap. Don't sit around and wait for someone to hand you the priesthood. Don't sit around and wait for marriage. Don't sit around and wait. I'll do this when I have a mission. I'll do this when I'm a mother. Don't wait for any calling or any office. Do not wait. That is Sister Bingham's message. Instead, she calls for immediate, proactive influence. By drawing on the power and authority received through temple covenants, contemporary women are expected to make it happen rather than passively waiting for life to happen to them. By adopting this paradigm, modern women fulfill the measure of their creation today, according to President Bingham. She concludes, by sacrificing what is less important for that which is eternal, women can transcend the limitations of their circumstances and become literal saviors of their fellow men. On a personal note, while I have great sympathy for women in our church who are hurt and confused about why they don't have the priesthood, I also think that we're missing the point in the focus of that discussion. Frankly, the most effective women don't have time for that question. They're too busy out doing the things. They're too busy saving their fellow man. They're too busy acting in priesthood power in all of the ways that the Lord sets before them. Esther, this is what Esther does. She's leading, she's serving, she's sacrificing without worrying about it being her official calling or not. When women feel, I can't lead if I don't have the priesthood, they're not really thinking in the way that Esther was thinking. She leads without being asked, even at risk of her own life. For young women or women of any age in our church who wish they had the priesthood, I would suggest taking on Esther's style. She's too busy leading and serving to worry about it. That's not to say there isn't a lot of pain in the perceived inequality. I know that there is. But Esther's example of powerful leadership based on covenantal purity and obedience helps us see that the work is needed beyond whatever title you want to put on it. And it's the work that is important, not the title. Thank you for joining me in this chat about Esther. Next week, we move on to Job, and that will be really fun. See you then.